Good morning, everyone. I am so excited to introduce our inaugural Anti-Racism Seed Grants Grand Round. Just to give a little bit of perspective, a few years ago, in an effort to combat a lot of the racism that we were seeing in our country and in our communities, there were three seed grants that were sponsored specifically for people in our department to help boost their efforts to fight racism. And I think we have three fantastic presentations today about what those efforts involved and what came out of those. So I'm really excited to share that with you all. To give a little bit more, I'll transition over to Dr. Beth.
Thank you, Dr. Helt. Yeah, so this is our inaugural launch of the Anti-Racism and Mental Health Seed Grant, and it's our first showcase with really three talented presenters. And just to give some historical context, that these grants were made possible by community organizing. So crowdsourcing fundraising efforts by the UCLA Psychiatry residency class of 2020, co-sponsored by the Psychiatry Diversity Advisory Committee, and education funds from the General Psychiatry Residency Program. And so we all came together really to support scholarship that's going to further health equity and anti-racism and mental health care. And really, there's not a lot of opportunities to get funding for work like this. And so we're really trying to be the change that we want to see and contribute meaningfully to anti-racist efforts in mental health. And so with that, I will pass it over to Dr. Castillo, who's going to introduce our first speaker.
Hi, everyone. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Rohit Mukherjee. Dr. Mukherjee grew up in central Pennsylvania, raised by his Bengali family. He attended college at Georgetown University. And after college, he worked as an elementary school teacher in DC for children with special needs. He then completed the MD-MPH program at Drexel University College of Medicine. And while in medical school, he dedicated himself to all of the topics that you'll hear him talk about today: trauma, racial justice, drug policy. In medical school, he served as a community organizer and outreach worker, distributing naloxone, syringes, wound care supplies to drug-using communities in Philadelphia. He helped launch a mail-based naloxone delivery program for the greater Philadelphia area. He worked with community-based organizations to organize direct actions for safe consumption sites. He was a steering committee coordinator for a student-run clinic that served injection drug users, sex workers, and individuals with unstable housing. He interned at the Philadelphia Department of Public Health, where he conducted community trainings on overdose prevention and naloxone administration. And for all of this work, he received numerous awards, including the U.S. Public Health Service's Excellence in Public Health Award, which is a national honor. He's continued his incredible leadership in our residency as our co-chief resident for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and he's just an all-star. So I'm just so glad that you all get to hear from him today, and I'll turn it over now to you, Dr. Mukherjee.
Thank you so much, Dr. Castillo, for that kind intro. It's flooring. I'm just going to share my screen, and let's get started. There you go. Can you all see my screen? Great. Okay. So today I have the pleasure to talking to you about a project that I'm doing about opioid-related overdoses among Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people experiencing homelessness. So to start off, I have no financial disclosures, and I also wanted to start off with a land appreciation for the Tongva, Italian, Serrano, and Gish and Chumash people who just contribute so much to the diversity of Los Angeles, and then also just have such a strong legacy as well. This project was inspired largely after learning that opioid-related overdoses are the leading cause of death for people experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles. So if we think about risk differentials, unhoused Angelenos have a 36 times higher rate of overdose compared to housed Angelenos. And there are significant racial disparities. Between 2018 and 2019, Black people experiencing homelessness had an overdose rate that doubled. Latinx people experiencing homelessness had a rate that increased by a third, while the rate was largely similar for white folks who are unhoused. This increase is largely due to the emergence of fentanyl in local drug markets. Fentanyl, or in my talk, I'm going to be talking about illicitly manufactured fentanyl, is an opioid which is 50 to 100 times stronger than heroin and it's been increasing in our local drug supply, causing dramatic, basically just issues among Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities. To zoom out a little bit, in Los Angeles between 2016 and 2019, we had an increase in overdoses of 1,280%, and Black communities have the highest overdose rate in Los Angeles. And this is reflective of the current state of the opioid epidemic, which categorically is just not white. We often think about the opioid epidemic in three phases, defined by the drivers of the overdose crisis. First, with natural semi-synthetic opioids, largely prescribed opioids, then heroin, and then synthetic opioids. Because like racialized narratives are so important to basically policy and then scholarship, I'm just going to actually briefly discuss a little bit about whitewashing of the epidemic and then how that relates to current service provision in general. So we're commonly taught to actually think about the overdose epidemic or the opioid epidemic in 1999 in concert with an just boom of prescription opioids. The number of prescription opioids quadrupled between 1994 and 2004, leading to a dramatic rise in overdose deaths due to prescription opioids. This was largely centered in rural America, described as an iatrogenic epidemic, with media descriptions describing a very vulnerable sympathetic group of people, articles entitled "The Addict Next Door," with discussions about how Black patients were shielded from this crisis, and limited media attention to the fact that Indigenous communities were having parallel rises in overdoses and had similar overdose rates compared to white communities. What's interesting about this is how it actually focuses on how when there's a drug epidemic in white communities, you get public health and treatment compared to more punishment carceral policies when there are epidemics centered in communities of color. And interestingly enough, overdoses have actually been increasing in the United States since 1979, with very limited media attention and then public health response when Black and white communities had similar overdose rates between 1979 and 1999, with emergence of public health responses when there was a majority white group of people who were passing away. So overall, this just echoes the fact that we need more of an anti-racism response to these crises. And then also to combat the fact that the traditional war on drugs mentality for drug epidemics basically minimizes stories and sympathy towards people of color. As the epidemic progressed, heroin became the leading driver of the overdose crisis due to decrease in prescriptions and then the number of drug monitoring programs too. There was limited media attention to the fact that there was increasing Black and Latinx mortality in urban areas. And then there was also more racialized descriptions of needing to actually target drug dealers to actually continue to protect white America. Since 2016, the overdose crisis has been predominantly due to fentanyl, which, well, like I've said, is an opioid that's 50 to 100 times stronger than heroin. There's strong concern for contamination of both opioids and then of synthetic of stimulants as well. Overdose rates continue to rise in urban settings for Black and Latinx folks. There was concern for contamination of stimulants. There's just been even worse overdose rates due to COVID. And then terrifyingly enough, since 2020, Black Indigenous communities have had the highest overdose rates. What I'm trying to emphasize is the fact that public health response often is centered around needs of white drug users. which can create programs which are specific for that community, or just frankly race blind. Buprenorphine is a great example of this. This tracks the number of office visits where buprenorphine was actually filled over time. And buprenorphine is one of the treatments for opioid use disorder. And you can see just how dramatically buprenorphine prescriptions increased for white populations, with stagnation and limited prescriptions for Black and other races. This is very similar for harm reduction programming too. This study basically was looking at the amount of training and then like carrying of naloxone, which is an opioid antagonist, which we truly want to just get out to as many drug users and family members of drug users as a way to actually combat overdoses. You can actually end up seeing the disparity in number of naloxone trainings between white and Black drug users. And then ultimately in terms of the amount of like the percentage of times that naloxone is always present during opioid use between white and Black drug users. Overdose risk in general is just highly complex. There's so many factors that actually go into it. And this kind of, the whole point of this study is to try to actually further elucidate aspects of overdose risk. And it helped develop like the story of Black and brown drug users, given the fact that war on drugs ends up actually depriving people of their narratives and of the complex stories that people have. So my study has its goals of better understanding the landscape of services, characterizing overdose risk, and then using participatory methods and advocacy to support BLNA drug users. In general, the study has 3 parts. So I have a key stakeholder interviews, which I have a goal of 20 interviews with experts in the field of overdose prevention, addiction services, and then homeless services recruited through strategic sampling. And then participant interviews, which also have 3 components, where I interview Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people experiencing homelessness. And interestingly and fun enough, we get to actually partner with a community organization called Sidewalk Project, which will be helping with basically hiring community experts who have lived experience, who are drug users themselves, in order to actually help with the recruitment and then analysis of data too. And lastly, I will be doing ethnographic fieldwork in Skid Row, observing service provision, discussing overdose risk, and seeing through participant observation how service delivery and overdose prevention is delivered in the field. I'm focusing in Skid Row, both because of the concentration of minoritized communities, unhoused folks, and then of service provision as well. Because if we can actually see the difficulties of that exist in Skid Row right now, it'll better actually inform us about Los Angeles in general, since that's where services are largely concentrated right now. To date, I've reached out to 45 individuals for key stakeholder interviews, have completed 5. I've also created awesome partnerships with Sidewalk Project, which I've told you a little bit about, and then the National Harm Reduction Coalition. We're working on solidifying basically hiring of 2 community experts. I've done a variety of outreach shifts as well. And these are some like emergent themes, which I'm really excited to actually talk about and then further explore. Respondents have actually described insufficient support for outreach workers of color, which that can be psychologically too, due to actually not having like enough mental health support to actually support people with lived experience, and then also just structurally due to low payment. There's a limited number of BLNA staff and providers with mostly white leadership in terms of the landscape of organizations, which leads to concerns for bias. And interestingly, in outreach organizations, people have discussed how there might be apprehension to working with communities of color due to their feeling as if people don't want services versus perceived threats of violence, which is definitely a topic which I want to further explore in all fields. And police and then different forms of surveillance have had like interesting impacts in terms of overdose risk. With confiscation of naloxone, both in terms of housing authorities, and then like limited concern for overdose among police as well. For my next steps, I'm excited to complete participant and stakeholder interviews, continue to collaborate with different community partners, and then work on some more participatory methods in general with community feedback sessions on any findings that I have. And then also we can actually all work together on policy and advocacy next steps. I am so thankful for being able to do this project. So I wanted to thank the Department of Psychiatry for this opportunity. And additionally wanted to thank my main research mentor, Dr. Castillo, who's been just so wonderful all throughout this, along with other mentors, Dr. Nina Harawa and Dr. Joe Friedman, my collaborators, Sidewalk Project and the National Harm Reduction Coalition, and my amazingly supportive residency program. I encourage everyone to actually hearing and then getting trained on how to use naloxone, the opioid antagonist that I mentioned before. I'm happy to actually provide overdose reversal training for anyone. And if you want to actually use any of these resources in terms of a basic overdose response training, and then other resources here as well, feel free to. These are my sources. These are more sources. And I would just like to thank you for your time.
All right. Well, I think it's now my privilege to be introducing Dr. Gammada today. I've known Dr. Gammada since graduate school at the City University of New York when she was on her way in and I was on my way out. And really I knew from the start that she was going to go on to do great things. And I've been so fortunate to have continued to be able to work with her. Dr. Gammada came to UCLA as a geropsychology and neuropsychology intern, and then went on to complete her postdoctoral fellowship here, also in geropsychology and neuropsychology. We were then very fortunate to be able to hire her as a new attending in neuropsychology this year, and the co-director of a new and exciting community engagement clinic in our neuropsychology program. Among her many accolades, Dr. Gammada has served on the board of the Alzheimer's Association California Southland chapter for the past few years, and she recently received the Distinguished Early Career Spark Award from the Society for Black Neuropsychology. She's also co-authored groundbreaking academic pieces really about creating anti-racist practices in psychological assessment, and her leadership, particularly in advancing the principles of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, have just brought so much to our department in her short time here. And I'm very excited for you all to hear about her amazing work, thanks in part to this anti-racism seed grant. So without further ado, it's my honor to introduce Dr. Gammada.
Dr. Van Dyke, thank you so much. It is a joy and an honor to work alongside you, and I'm so grateful for that generous introduction. Let me try to share my screen. We're good. Hopefully someone will put something in the chat if we're not. So good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to share the introduction of the Black Joy in Caregiving project with you. This project was birthed from conversation with community about our collective curiosity regarding our resilience and also our hope to build a wellness intervention that's really rooted in our strength. But before I jump into our project, I want to begin with a quote from Dr. Ruha Benjamin to really frame the magnitude of this work, of our anti-racist work. Dr. Benjamin reminds us that racism is productive, not in the literal sense of being good, but in the literal capacity of racism to produce things of value to some as it wreaks havoc on others. We are taught to think of racism as an aberration, a glitch, an accident, an isolated incident, a bad apple, in the backwoods and outdated, rather than innovative, systemic, diffuse, and attached incident. The entire orchard in the ivory tower, forward-facing and productive. And she reminds us as a sociologist that they often say that race is socially constructed, but what we fail to state is the corollary that racism constructs. And so for those of us who want to engage in anti-racist work and want to construct care that is grounded in justice, in wellness, and in joy, we can't ignore the forces at play. And we really have to be intentional in the application of our scientific methodology, in the selection of our questions, our tools, and the use of our tools. And so as I dive into our project today, I'll share with you the ways in which abolitionists, healers, cultural strategists, artists, health equity scholars, and voices of community have fueled this work and provided me with guiding principles to really decentralize science and the application of our methodology. So this grant mechanism was established at a time riddled with so much, where our individual, ancestral, and collective nervous system were and continue to be on fire. And as scientists, clinicians, fellow humans, we do ourselves justice by orienting to the fact that every aspect of our professional practice is affected by the current socio-political climate, and navigating the power structures that underlie social order, what our elder and now ancestor bell hooks termed an imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. And we are all personally on the front line of justice work. And so in my work as a geriatric neuropsychologist, I am fascinated with the resiliency that aging requires and how to support my patients to live their best lives. Additionally, though, I think we need more emphasis in understanding the resistance that it demands for populations who have inherited disadvantages in our society. And I'll define this shortly. I'm also a health disparity researcher. And I find as researchers, sometimes we get abstract in our definition of the work. And I want to center us on a basic definition that when we're dealing with health disparities, it is fundamental to the justice movement as we are protecting people's ability to live. And so I come into this work as a first generation Black immigrant whose multiple identities inform the lens of my science and also my clinical practice. And so as a neuropsychologist whose research is on cognitive aging, one of the central questions I get in community is about who is at risk for dementia. And often community members share with me the brutal statistics that they've been informed that Black Americans are 2 times as likely to have dementia. And in these conversations, I always find it powerful to share health equity revolutionary Dr. Kamara Jones's framework in highlighting the why. And I've adapted this slide set with permission from another brilliant health equity champion, Dr. Rhea Boyd, who beautifully and simplistically illustrates Dr. Jones's model. And so typically as clinicians, when we're talking about the risk for any disease, we focus on pre-existing conditions. So we're talking about underlying conditions like hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, hyperlipidemia, obesity, and so on, what Dr. Jones calls inherited disease. When we do this, when we focus on inherited disease, we miss the full context and fail to acknowledge the root causes, including the ways in which segregation has profoundly shaped the racial distribution of heart disease in this country, how chronic discrimination increases rates of hypertension within communities of color, how the racial wealth gap concentrates poverty within communities of color, how environmental racism shapes who's exposed to pollutants chronically, how toxic stress and exposure increases one's cortisol and drive your allostatic load to weather or silently age your cells so that one's cellular age can be in advance of your chronological age. And so these are all inherited disadvantages that put certain communities at higher risk for disease. And so in my conversations with community, I share this to fully contextualize why Black people are 2 times more likely to get dementia than whites. And one of the biggest lessons I've learned in these community conversations is how empowering it is when we contextualize risk. And so when you do make a lifestyle recommendation as a clinician and a provider, it lands differently. So when I talk about eating a low sodium diet to counter hypertension for my patients that are Black, I emphasize it's not because Black people generally eat more salt than others, but rather it's about the salty nature of the world that we are navigating. And these conversations also tapped into our resilience. And so it sparked questions about our survival. How are we surviving despite it all? What does it mean to be Black with all of these inherited disadvantages? And as we dived into these conversations, we began to explore what our very own Dr. Hansen calls social technology, which are community-based social approaches to promote health. And these discussions led us to conversations on Black joy. And so the conceptual definition of Black joy is to help protect a mentally healthy space inside, despite all of the reoccurring trauma on the outside. And in her brilliant book, Black Joy, Stories of Resistance, Resilience, and Restoration, author Tracy Michelle Lewis Jiggets writes, "When joy is Black, it is the radical demonstration of our humanity, our laughter, our ancestral mandate to keep moving in a rhythm of our own, set in a cultural context and struggle specific to the experiences as members of the African diaspora." And so our collective became curious together. And we became curious about how Black joy factors into caregiving for a loved one with dementia. And I also shared with our collective, my knowledge from the very few studies that have examined Black caregivers of loved ones with dementia that emphasize that they have strong coping abilities despite experiencing high levels of stress and navigating very complex and difficult caregiving situations. And community members also shared with me that the current models of caregiving that emphasize caregiver burden did not land accurately for them and their experiences, and often felt offensive. And so often I heard the statement, "Caregiving is hard, but it is not a burden for me to care for my loved one." And so together we got curious. Our collective wanted to address the question of, how does Black joy manifest in caregiving? And This seed grant allowed us to address this question. And so we launched the Black Joy in Caregiving project in May of 2022 to understand the construct of resiliency in Black dementia caregivers. And in designing our study flyer, we wanted to connect emotionally. And my dear friend and brilliant artist, Walter Cruz, designed our study flyer. And he really embodied the intention of our collective, which was to foster trust emotionally so that folks can get curious with us and explore our collective's question. And so in sharing our methodology with you, I really want to emphasize that community was involved in every step of this project. And embracing community in scientific methodology really shifted my role into one of a facilitator rather than the traditional description of a principal investigator. Also, my community partners became co-creators in this work with me rather than participants in my study. Additionally, embracing community into the methodology also allowed us to move intentionally with language. Typically, when we're doing qualitative research, we study what we call focus groups. And community members expressed that that language didn't land well for them, and that they felt that they were being put under a microscope and being studied. Rather, we chose to call our groups restorative circles. And this was to really honor the healing power of sharing space together and sharing narratives. I also want to highlight a very important win when you design with community and where you embrace community and scientific methodology. Recruitment becomes incredibly easy. Just 2 days after we launched our project, we secured all of our participants for our study. And so our project had 2 parts. First part, we held restorative circles with our caregivers of loved ones with dementia. And in 4 separate sessions led by myself and a community partner, Ms. Petra Niles, we created a togetherness as we processed with past and present caregivers of loved ones with dementia to really examine how Black joy played out in their caregiving experiences. We are currently analyzing the data from our circles with a dear friend and social justice scholar with specialized expertise in qualitative research, Dr. Laura Minero. And the second part of our project will be a community conference that we have planned for this spring, where we will share our findings, the findings of our thematic analysis with our collective, and really check in on how our findings land and gather feedback to really continue to foster a bi-directional transmission of knowledge. And so our goal is to generate a theory on Black caregiving resiliency using the language of community. So really building from ground up here. Moreover, our long-term goal is to build and nourish the work that the grant has seeded, right? And so we're exploring funding mechanisms that allow us to move at the speed of trust, embrace community as central to our scientific pursuits, and nurture an additive horizontal science rather than an extractive vertical science. So just some takeaways that I have for my learning in this work and this project is first the demonstration of our connectedness. Our health and well-being is inextricably tied to the wellness of our communities. Second, anti-racist work is rooted in love. And as poet Nikki Giovanni reminds us, love is a responsibility, and we have to show up correct as scientists. Lastly, this work demands that we show up authentically in our fullness. Black joy is a demonstration of, and lastly, Black joy is a demonstration of how joy can sit alongside grief. And I share this work with you today. And as I share this work with you today, I also want to honor a beloved elder who rooted me in justice work and transitioned this past Sunday. Thank you so much for your time and for the opportunity to share this labor of love with you today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gammada, and my condolences for your loss. Our next speaker is Dr. Ann Crawford-Day. Originally from Pennsylvania, Dr. Crawford-Day studied anthropology and international relations at Brown University, then studied medicine at Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. As a medical student, she led outreach efforts to teach about new insurance options under the Affordable Care Act and founded the East Harlem Health Committee, ACA, and Healthcare Access Working Group. She graduated from medical school with distinction in research and a distinction in medical education, was inducted into the AOA, and won the Gold Humanism Honor Society. Dr. Crawford-Day earned her master's in public health at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, where she studied health policy and social behavior sciences. Within the UCLA Department of Psychiatry, Dr. Crawford-Day was the chief resident of the UCLA CGP Community Global Psychiatry Program, the chief resident of medical education, and the chief resident of interpersonal therapy clinic. She founded and facilitated the UCLA Psychiatry Department's anti-racism learning groups, where groups of faculty and trainees met weekly to read anti-racism texts and process together how to apply to their personal and professional lives. And she's served on the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Subcommittee at UCLA, on the Council of Communications in the American Psychiatric Association, the Association of Medical Colleges, and so many more accolades. Her research interests include social determinants of mental health and mental health service access. Her clinical interests include reproductive psychiatry, trauma-related disorders, and individual psychotherapies. She's now volunteer clinical faculty at Scripps Mercy Family Medicine Residency Program and teaching family medicine residents. And so without further ado, Dr. Crawford-Day, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bath. And it's an honor to be here presenting along with Dr. Mukherjee and Dr. Gammada. I am very happy to be back with you all talking about the anti-racism learning groups. So here we go. So many of you have actually participated in these groups here within the Department of Psychiatry. My goal is that by the end of this talk, you'll be able to describe the design and purpose of the anti-racism learning groups, whether or not you participated in one yourself. So to begin, I'm going to explain the origins of the anti-racism learning groups by taking us back to a very difficult time for many of us, the spring of 2020. In that time, we witnessed a series of brutal murders of unarmed Black men and women, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Ahmaud Arbery, may they rest in peace, at the hands of police or vigilantes. And that was on top of a COVID pandemic disproportionately killing Black communities. These high-profile murders challenged many of us to again confront systems of racism in our society and in our workplaces. And our own department here reckoned with how best to respond. I saw that the people continuing to speak up about racial injustice and the needs of Black patients and Black department members were still almost only Black and certainly almost only BIPOC department members who were shouldering an immense emotional and professional load. Our own former chief resident, Michael Mensah, Dr. Mensah, called upon white colleagues to reduce the minority tax, which is the burden of labor and energy demanded of BIPOC employees and community members to counteract racism, and instead take on a majority tax. He writes, at one such gathering, exhausted by, quote, minority taxation without representation, I pointed out the dearth of Black men among us, asking how much demonstrators would pay beyond symbolism to make Black Lives Matter more in medicine. That question prompted a new formulation. White physicians should pay, quote, majority taxes, comprising discomfort, energy, and capital. These taxes would include 3 initial steps to guide good intentions toward better impact. Acknowledge your white privilege, no matter how uncomfortable, leverage privilege to highlight medical racism, and humbly and actively implement anti-racist policies. So heeding this call from Dr. Mensah and building on my own experiences in developing curricula on racism in medicine and in facilitating discussions with other white people on anti-racism, I proposed a program to residency and DEI leadership, the Anti-Racism Learning Groups. With feedback from the JEDI Subcommittee of Residents, along with Drs. DeBonis, Helt, Castillo, Cajigas, and especially Dr. Bath, I further developed the proposal for these groups. With particular help from Dr. Bath and a group of collaborators who she pulled together, including Maggie Cronin, who separately had a similar idea to start groups on the psychology side of the department, we further refined the design, and Dr. Bath helped secure financial and administrative support. So that finally, in January 2021, the first anti-racism learning groups launched. And these groups had 3 core intentions. 1, to deepen anti-racism learning. 2, to unpack our own individual and collective participation in white supremacy. And 3, to cultivate community across the department committed to anti-racism. The Anti-Racism Learning Group is an educational intervention that focuses on group processing and learning in parallel with individual reading and reflection. This method facilitates relationship building along with individual learning, reflecting, and processing. So the groups are guided by this book, Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad. This book provides an introduction to foundational topics core to understanding racism and anti-racism. It is written to an audience of people who experience white privilege. I chose it for its accessibility, its focus on anti-Black racism and white supremacy, and its reflection questions, which serve as a guide for the personal reflection we are asking participants to do. The focus on anti-Black racism was intentional in the selection of this text, as a particular understanding of anti-Black racism is critical to understanding racial oppression in our country and in our world, and is essential for meaningful engagement in anti-racism efforts. This book is divided into 4 themes. The first theme includes foundational topics such as white privilege and white silence. The second focuses on racism towards Black women, children, and men, and other racist stereotypes. The third week covers optical allyship and white saviorism, among other topics. And then in the 4th week, the book concludes with a focus on moving towards action, engaging with family and friends, defining values, and making commitments. Each topic, so each of those 28 topics in the book has a section in which the topic is introduced and explained. There are personal examples provided related to that concept, and then each topic ends with the reflection questions. So participants were expected to read the topics and complete their own reflection on the prompts. And for example, the concept or the theme on white privilege, which is the very first topic, the reflection questions included: what negative experiences has your white privilege protected you from throughout your life? What positive experiences has your white privilege granted you throughout your life that BIPOC generally do not have? And what have you learned about your white privilege that makes you uncomfortable? And those are just a few of the questions. They're usually about 5 to 6 for each topic. So along with this individual learning and reflection, participants met in groups weekly. Groups were organized by professional position in the department. So for example, faculty, trainees, and staff, with the goal of minimizing power hierarchies. And they were also organized based on scheduling preferences within those positional groups. The group process for the anti-racism learning groups was adapted from the Circle Way, which is a process for group learning designed by Christina Baldwin and Anne Linnea. The Circle Way relies on 3 principles: rotation of leadership, sharing of responsibility, and reliance on wholeness. It emphasizes that there is, quote, a leader in every chair. And the circle weighs emphasis on leadership rotation and shared responsibility, attempts to reduce power dynamics that could recreate white supremacy in action. And for this reason, it's recommended by Layla Saad for group adaptation of the Me and White Supremacy book. So most groups met for about 90 minutes weekly, starting with a welcome and check-in, moving into individual sharing based on those reflection questions, followed by group discussion, and then concluding with checkouts. There are 3 roles, which I won't get into in detail just as in the interest of time, but one of the roles that rotates between members is called the guardian. And the guardian is responsible for monitoring the group process and progress. So then in each group, one individual served as what we call the meta-guardian. And this was a role we designed so that each group could receive additional support from the central organizers. Meta-guardians participated in weekly supervision with Tanisha Wright, who was formerly the Director of Community Healing and Trauma Prevention at the LA County Department of Public Health. And she's now actually the Director for the whole Bureau of Victim Services for LA County. She's also been hired as a consultant to other UCLA departments and programs to facilitate racial healing circles and conversations. We intentionally created the structure with an outside non-UCLA supervisor with expertise in equity and racial healing. And during that weekly supervision, meta-guardians shared challenges and triumphs that emerged during the weekly sessions in a non-judgmental, de-identified manner. The weekly supervision was a space to collectively troubleshoot, process, and develop strategies to support the group, which the meta-guardians could then bring back to their individual weekly groups. So in 2021, we had 53 department members who participated in 8 groups, which met weekly for an average of 16 sessions. In 2022, 35 department members participated in 6 groups for an average of 13 sessions, including 1 longer weekend session. We conducted pre-group demographic surveys, which among other data showed participants identified in 2021 as 64% white, 0% Black, 9% Latinx, 9% Asian, 6% biracial or multiracial, and 13% other. In 2022, similar percentage, actually the exact same percentage, 64% of participants identified as white. And then there were similar percentages of Latinx and Asian, biracial and multiracial participants. And then there were 4% of participants who identified as Black. In 2021, in terms of department positions, just under half of participants were faculty members. And then a little over half of participants were trainees, and 9% identified as staff. And as you'll notice, that adds up to more than 100% because some folks identified both as faculty and as staff. In 2022, similarly, a little under 50% of participants were faculty. There were fewer overall trainees, this time encompassing a broader range of different types of trainees, including fellows and practicum student, and then 36% of participants identified as staff members. So in addition to that pre-group demographic survey, we conducted pre and post intervention surveys using 6 different questionnaires that measure attitudes towards racism. Our wonderful medical student researcher, Yasmin Abbey, and our amazing quantitative research mentor, Nastasia Haljal, are analyzing the survey data to see if there were any significant differences in pre and post group scores. And then in addition to this quantitative analysis, we completed 3 1 to 2 hour long focus groups with 10 anti-racism learning group participants following the completion of the program. And the focus groups were deemed exempt by the University IRB. So I will share with you some of the themes that emerged in the qualitative analysis from those focus groups. So the overwhelming majority of participants, 9 out of 10 in focus groups, and also the majority in another survey that we completed, described having very positive experiences in the group. Many spontaneously stated that they recommended it to others, or that they wished all their colleagues participated in the groups. However, one participant in the focus groups did describe an overall negative experience. This participant found that a lack of open critique of the book and an emphasis on disclosure of personal racism in the group created a culture of rigid thinking about racism, which led that participant to disengage from the group. So as people were describing their overall positive experiences in the group, they described finding the book useful by teaching foundational concepts and terminology. They found value in learning and building community with group members. They found that their fellow learners shared varying perspectives, experiences, and resources. As one faculty member stated, "It was nice being with work colleagues. I've done a lot of this work personally, and I haven't done it at work. And so it was really a unique experience to be able to say, this popped up, and be able to kind of troubleshoot together and to stop and use the awareness we learned. So being able to process that during the group, I think we're applying it in vivo." Participants also, as they were reflecting on the experiences that they had, described some of the key lessons that they learned in the groups. One faculty participant described one of their key lessons being white supremacy is something that we are all part of, and it surrounds all of us in our culture. So we all have to have a part in working to fix it. And then other participants shared that by viewing and discussing the pervasiveness of racism in our nation and their own participation in racist systems, they were able to reduce their own shame and guilt and move towards becoming more actively anti-racist. Another theme that emerged in the qualitative data was that learning in the anti-racism learning groups had lasting impacts on participants' anti-racism skills within their multitude of professional roles that many of us hold. So as clinician, supervisor, teacher, clinic leader, colleague, and researcher. So some illustrative examples here. One participant said, "I felt like I was more prepared in the group, and the people in my group also felt more prepared or equipped, just kind of reducing the barriers to speaking up or making moves about it." Another participant said, "Thinking about the importance of my role in furthering the anti-racist mission of our clinic, or of modeling what it looks like to be a supervisor who incorporates that in, has been on the forefront for me. And the group definitely emboldened me. It gave me more of that feeling that I can be a little bit more overt and intentional about these practices because they fit right in with the training goals." A third participant said, "I feel like just when I consider the life of a patient or a colleague, a friend, a neighbor, anybody, there's just a little more resolution to what their experience might be, and more little doors for compassion and for curiosity in just understanding the complexity of somebody else's experience." So to summarize, the ARLG participants, in terms of those lasting impacts, said in the focus groups that those impacts occurred outside of and beyond the conclusion of the groups on their abilities to communicate about racism, intervene when racism occurs, teach about racism and anti-racism, include awareness of racism and anti-racism in clinical supervision, approach patients, colleagues, and others with more compassion. And they described a shifted perspective on the impact of racism on their patients and a sense of feeling empowered to more directly align their clinical practice and leadership with anti-racism principles. And one other example of lasting impacts was that there are still groups that meet, not weekly, on a less regular basis, but to my knowledge, there's one group that still meets from our first year, so 2021, and then groups that still meet from our 2022 year. And then going back to our third theme from the focus groups, there were several challenges in designing and implementing the groups, and focus group participants made really valuable recommendations to improve the groups in the future. One was around sustainability. So participants sought direction on future programming or resources after the groups ended. As one participant said, the pragmatic what next piece, we are looking for that, I think, in our continuation of our anti-racism journey. So focus group participants recommended potential solutions, including creating spaces for groups to continue discussions, which I'll come back to in a little bit. Another set of challenges was encouraging more people to participate in the groups and supporting group members to attend more consistently. In the initial 2 years of the anti-racism learning groups, the most motivated participants self-selected to join, with a decrease in participant numbers between years 1 and 2. In addition, a minority of participants, was particularly trainees, had difficulty with consistently attending group meetings, which occurred in the evenings, and group meeting trainees have variable evening call schedules. So that was a difficulty as well. To address these, and as one of the participants said, I felt like a lot of transformative change could happen if it was more widespread and in a way that was incentivized for people who might not self-select to participate. So to address these paired challenges, participants noted that the program could benefit from increasing incentives and reducing barriers to participate in the groups. As I mentioned, groups occurred during the evening hours, so that was uncompensated hours after the workday had concluded. Some of the recommendations, among others, included scheduling the groups during work hours and or compensating the time spent in groups after the workday. The final challenge was around building community. Beyond the ARLG organizers, the names of group participants were not shared. Restricting information on group membership maintained members' privacy and allowed for anonymity of group members in the MetaGuardian supervision group. But this anonymity came at a cost of limiting some of the community building that we could have had beyond the individual groups and building a further community. As one participant said, I know the people who are in my group, who are in our group, and I know some other people from other groups, but I think there's a sense of community that could have been expanded even further. Although I don't know how you could do that while maintaining that privacy that may have been important for some people to join and share the way they did. In response to that last piece of feedback, we did hold an end of the year celebration for all the participants from the 2022 year and the 2021 year, and talked about kind of other potential ways to invite people to come together. And in response to some of those other points of feedback about wanting next steps, there was an interest in those kind of future directions and resources. Our student intern, Giselle Reynoso, led the design of a resource guide that contains recommended books, films, etc., as well as information on anti-racism groups in the Department of Psychiatry, the medical school, and the hospital system-wide. This resource guide was distributed to all participants in June of last year. And if anyone is interested in it, you can contact myself, Dr. Bath, or others to get a copy of that. I realize we're coming up to time, so I'm going to be very quick here. So based on feedback from the focus groups and other feedback we received, there is an interest in continuing the groups in some form with another round for new participants and or with programming to engage past participants. So some ideas that participants suggested were journal clubs, lectures, series, or social events to maintain that learning and community building and also accountability. So now's the time for a plug. If anyone wants to continue this work, there is interest and there's also a lot of support. There's a wonderful team of people who I am going to thank in the next slide. So if anybody is interested in working with those folks and helping continue this work, please reach out to any of them or to me. You could work with them if you're a psychiatry trainee, potentially through the clinician educator concentration, or if you're a psychology trainee through the internship elective, which we have kind of put together a proposal for. Okay, so finally, these groups would not have been possible without this incredible team. I'm going to go very quickly, but everyone is deserving of a lot of thanks. So Dr. Bath has championed this work at the highest levels of leadership. Tanisha Wright was our incredible MetaGuardian facilitator. Drs. Debonis, Hallett, Castillo, and Cajigas informed the design and launch of the groups. There was a group of dedicated MetaGuardians from year one who were very involved in year two and in the evaluation piece, and that was Dr. Siani, Kelman, Hajal, Tingis, Mukherjee, Olsen, and Cronin. Dr. Jadi Maksudi guided the qualitative assessment of the groups. Yasmin Abbey is our fourth-year medical student who's done a fantastic job in the analysis of the groups. Giselle Reynoso created that guide that I just showed you. And the groups would not have been possible without the administrative support of Miriam, Georgia, and Jennifer. And finally, I'd like to thank PDAC and the other funders, including the class of 2020, who were behind the Anti-Racism and Mental Health Seed grants. So thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Crawford-Day. We are really close to time. We're at noon, so I'm just going to be mindful of our AV support and just take two questions. The first from Dr. Minero. Really appreciated learning about everyone's unique approaches and pedagogical approaches to your anti-racist projects. My question is for you, Anne. You mentioned that your focus groups were exempt from IRB. Could you clarify what that means and what made them exempt? There's common and well-known pushback and additional requirements in the conduct of qualitative work by our IRB board, so this piqued my curiosity.
Yeah, so great question. Just very quickly, it was a very long process with multiple iterations of IRB information that they requested. And as I think many people can understand, that took a very long time. But we did request exemption based on the fact that it was an educational intervention. And there were a lot of different questions, a lot of information, that we needed to provide around that. So it was a very involved and rigorous process, but eventually the IRB did grant us exemption based on it being an educational intervention.
Okay. Another question is specifically, it looks like this is also for you, Dr. Crawford-Day. Specifically, did the groups discuss racism coming from a patient towards a doctor and how to mediate that?
I imagine that it's very possible that that came up in groups. Because the text is not focused on medicine particularly, I think there's a lot of different ways that our experiences within medicine can come out in different topics. So I don't know with certainty if that was discussed. However, in the second round, there was an interest in having a BIPOC group specifically. And so there was a chance, I think, for BIPOC professionals within the department to be talking about their experiences, which I imagine this kind of situation would come up. So I think if you are interested in further information on how to mediate that, I would point you towards the Upstander guide that Dr. Bath, Dr. Tarrant, Dr. DeBonis created for the department, which is an incredible resource.
Teed us up because we are going to be actually launching some in-service trainings that are going to be led by Dr. Helt to help train our clinical staff primarily, but across our research centers and divisions, and upstanderism as a verb in action. Do we have any other questions for our amazing presenters? I would love for all of you to come back on camera just as part of the outro. You guys really are an inspiration. I was taking pictures of all the slides. You're really if the world is in your hands as the next generation, I feel like we're going to be all right. So thank you again for your scholarship and your thoughtfulness. That I think concludes our grand rounds.